Hello everybody and welcome back to another video. In today's video, we'll be taking a look at the 2023 gubernatorial elections, which are concentrated in 3 states. Of course, these are off-year elections, so they will get a little less attention than your typical midterm or presidential year, but they're still very important and they're actually very competitive. We're lucky because these races are going to be very interesting, to say the least. So we're just going to get right into it here. Again, if you have not done so already, please subscribe. Over the past month, a little over 2/3 of my viewers are not subscribed, so if you are one of those people, please help me out by subscribing. And yeah, we'll get into the video here. So we're going to start out with Louisiana, which is interesting because it is held by a Democrat, the governorship, John Bel Edwards. He's a conservative Dem. He's certainly kind of in the middle, I guess you could say, politically. Kind of takes Democratic stances on most issues, but is famously against abortion in most cases. So he's certainly an interesting fit for Louisiana, but he does get it done for Democrats here. So he's certainly someone that I think Democrats are going to miss because he is term limited. And without him, Democrats don't really have a clear path here. When you look at their candidates, it's really all they have is Sean Wilson, who's likely to advance to a runoff on behalf of the Democrats. Obviously, Gary Smith's been getting some attention. He's a state senator, but it's likely going to be Sean Wilson here. And he's not a bad candidate. I'd say he's kind of the best they can do realistically. But as you can see here, he's only polling at 27%, and he's the only Democrat in most of these polls. So you just, in a state like Louisiana, you'd imagine these undecided voters would go against the Democrats. And while Wilson might outrun Joe Biden, it will not be, by anywhere near enough to give him the victory. So I'm going to call this one a safe Republican race. Obviously, I do expect Sean Wilson to get more than 27% of the vote in the runoff, but I can't see him losing by any less than 19 or 20 in a runoff. So that to me is pretty clearly safe for the Republicans. Now, Mississippi, we're going to talk about this one. This, to me, is a pretty interesting race here. Obviously, Tate Reeves in 2019 only won by around 5%, which is a pretty bad margin for a Republican in Mississippi. And Democrats here have another good candidate. Jim Hood in 2019 was a good fit, but they're likely to run Brandon Presley. He's the presumptive nominee for their nomination. And Presley is a representative on the Mississippi Public Service Commission. He represents the Northern District, which it did vote for Trump, so he did win a district on that commission in Mississippi. It's not a House seat or a state legislative seat. It's a commission seat, and he won it, and it voted for Trump. So he is an overperformer. He has won Republican voters before, so there are a lot of Democrats enthusiastic about Presley's ability to win over voters and maybe narrowly eke out a win in Mississippi, especially considering Tate Reeves, the Republican, is facing a primary challenge from John Witcher and David Hardigree, and he's not popular, really. He's had pretty mediocre approval ratings for a Republican in a state as red as Mississippi, and he's overseen a pretty controversial first term as governor, and so that's also important to remember when you look at in 2019, where he wasn't even the incumbent governor. Phil Bryant obviously couldn't run, and so in 2019, Tate Reeves ran, and he won by 5, but he's arguably gotten more unpopular since then. And all this leads people to say, well, maybe Mississippi's going to go blue, maybe Brandon Presley's going to bring that crossover appeal to a statewide level and beat Tate Reeves. I don't think so. Mississippi is a very racially polarized state. When you look at how Democrats do, they always do very well with black voters in this western portion of the state, but they can never get over the hump with white voters, especially white voters in the suburbs. Most suburban white voters in the country are very swingy. I believe Biden lost white voters in the suburbs, but it was only by maybe 2 or 3 points. I don't know exactly the figure, but at a national level, white voters in the suburbs are very kind of split. But in Mississippi, they are super Republican, and these are the voters that turn out at the highest rate. It's not rural voters. It's not voters in urban areas. It's not black voters. It's not rural white voters. It's voters in the suburbs, and in Mississippi, suburbs are overwhelmingly white. And when you look at these off-year elections, they almost always have whiter electorates than general elections. And so, as a result of that, I just can't see the necessary turnout from Brandon Presley. Could he, in theory, get the turnout necessary to win? Potentially. Not very likely at all. Jim Hood, had he gotten presidential-type numbers from these counties that are majority black on the western portion of the state, on the border with Louisiana and Arkansas, he would potentially be the governor of Mississippi right now. That's just not likely to happen, and I think Brandon Presley, if Jim Hood couldn't do it in 2019, I don't think Brandon Presley can do it in an off-year election where the Democrats control the presidency. So that's a bit of bad news for Democrats, but I'm going to give them a bit of good news here because I think they're favored to win Kentucky. It's narrow, obviously the closest race this year, but I'm going to put it in the lean Democratic column. And that's because when you look at the results from previous Kentucky elections in the polls, it's a pretty competitive race, but I do think Andy Beshear is the unambiguous favorite. Um, in 2019, he defeated incumbent Republican Governor Matt Bevin by just over 5,000 votes, so it was a very close race. And he didn't even get a majority here, but he's gotten very popular during his time in office. He's, I would say, kind of made a name for himself as a moderate Democrat in Kentucky, and so that helps him because obviously Kentucky's a red state at the federal level, and if a Democrat is to win Kentucky, they're going to have to appeal to a lot of Republican voters. But Beshear has some downsides. His opponent, Daniel Cameron, is the Attorney General of the state. He's I'd say one of the strongest candidates Republicans could have recruited to run against him. And so for that reason, there's a lot of people who I think are, very skeptical of Beshear's ability to win re-election, especially, again, and it's a Biden-controlled environment. Generally speaking, when one party's in power, the party not in power does well in off-year or midterm elections. And we saw that in 2021 with Glenn Youngkin during the Obama and Trump years. We saw Democrats and Republicans respectively, or Republicans and Democrats respectively, do very well in off-year elections just because they were more energized. And in 2019, when Beshear first won, it was during the Trump presidency, so Democrats were more energized. Now, obviously, Democrats can win in red states during a Biden presidency, but it's harder for them to do so. And that's the main point people are making, that kind of is like, well, hold on, Beshear isn't going to win. Now, here's my argument for Beshear. When you look at the 2022 election results, the places where Democrats did the worst was just a factor of candidates, especially in governor's races. The governor's race for Democrats, I think, were most disappointed in the results were Florida and Georgia, I would say. And in Florida, they had a massive turnout discrepancy, which isn't, quite frankly, is not possible of being replicated in Kentucky. And in Georgia, it was because Stacey Abrams was simply a significantly worse candidate than Brian Kemp. She did not lead him in a single poll, where we haven't really gotten that many polls. And I will tell you, Andy Beshear leads Daniel Cameron in most polls. In fact, in Cameron's own internal, Beshear is up by 2. In Signal, which is another Republican pollster, they're tied. And in the only nonpartisan poll we've had, he's up by 9. I don't think he'll win by 9, but that's a pretty good sign when you're up by 9 in a nonpartisan poll. And so, to me, Beshear as the incumbent, I think, is going to really have a chance to use that to his advantage. And Kentucky is a red state federally, but locally, as you can see here, a lot of these counties in the coal country, in the more northeastern part of the state, they're ancestrally Democratic. They will be very solid for Republicans at a federal level, but down ballot, they can vote Democrat. And in fact, if you look at a state legislative map of Kentucky, state House, state Senate, whatever you want to do, you will see Democrats do hold a lot of those seats. It's really weird because they're super Trumpy, but Democrats do hold those seats down ballot. And so I think Beshear's a popular governor. Daniel Cameron is a good opponent, but he's not polling well. And I think ultimately Kentucky this year, especially after Laura Kelly won in Kansas last year, I think Democrats are going to win Kentucky. It's going to be close. I think it's only be 2 or 3 point victory, and it could narrow up. But for now, I believe Andy Beshear is favored. So those are my 2023 gubernatorial predictions. I kind of like these off-year elections because I can go more in depth in each state. But yeah, I think it's going to be an interesting year. Obviously, we also have the Pennsylvania Supreme Court election, which I'll be talking about more and more as we approach it. But I would say Kentucky specifically is going to be really fun to watch, and I look forward to covering it more. So that's for today's video. Thanks so much for watching. Subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you all in the next one.